My name is Eli Sandoval. I'm 26 years old, and this happened last fall in one of the most remote parts of southwestern Arizona, near the Mexican border. I wish I could say the only danger out there was the scorching sun, but as you'll see, we stumbled upon something far worse than desert heat. Before all this, I'd worked as a part-time outdoor guide, leading short tours for weekend campers. I considered myself practical and level-headed, not easily rattled by tall tales or ghost stories. So when my friend Manuel "Manny" Rojas, who was 28, invited me and two others to a final desert trek before he moved to Texas, I jumped at the chance. Manny said we'd explore a section of the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, famous for its towering cacti, rugged beauty, and very few visitors. He sold it as a once-in-a-lifetime journey. Manny's girlfriend, Isabel Delgado, was 25 and seemed both excited and anxious about going off-grid. She was deeply loyal to Manny, fiercely so, but I could tell she worried he was hiding something. My other two companions were Tom O'Connor, 27, and Kayla Johnson, 26. Tom was loud and headstrong, ready to prove himself in any situation. Kayla was more empathetic, drawn to folklore and the spiritual side of nature. She admitted she'd love to catch evidence of something otherworldly on her camera. We planned for a week-long excursion. I rode with Manny in his battered SUV while Isabel, Tom, and Kayla followed in Kayla's car. Our gear consisted of tents, sleeping bags, a basic first aid kit, and a water filter Kayla had just bought. In theory, it should have been enough. But trouble began practically the moment we left the main highway. A bullet-riddled sign greeted us at the turnoff into a rugged back road, warning travelers to proceed with caution. Smuggling activities had been reported in the area. Manny went silent when he saw that sign, glancing at his phone as if waiting for a signal that never came. Then the road got worse, turning into a rutted dirt track that kicked up clouds of dust. Without cell service, we were truly on our own. We reached a flat spot near an old wash as the sun dipped low, painting the desert in warm gold and red. Enormous organ pipe cacti stood silhouetted against the horizon. The place was breathtaking and eerily quiet. Isabel suggested we set up camp by a rocky outcrop for shelter from the wind. Tom immediately complained about the ground being too hard for tents, and Manny snapped back at him. Tension crackled. I found myself acting as a peacekeeper, trying to calm them both. Night brought strange noises. We heard distant howling that could have been coyotes, but it sounded off, like it had a weird cadence. Kayla came over to me at one point, her camera clutched tight, and whispered, "I saw something moving up on that ridge." I shone a flashlight, but saw only shifting shadows among the rocks. We tried to laugh it off, telling each other it was just local wildlife. Yet, Manny looked more uneasy than anyone. He paced around the campsite, muttering under his breath. In the morning, we discovered the water filter Kayla had purchased was malfunctioning. There were weird bubbles forming in the chamber, and it wouldn't pump correctly. That was our main source of clean water if we stayed more than a day or two. Manny said we should keep moving, maybe find a place closer to some known springs, but Tom argued we ought to fix the filter first. They nearly came to blows over the issue. Again, I stepped in to calm them down. Eventually, Manny won out. We packed our gear and started hiking deeper into the desert. The second night, we followed a narrow trail and set up camp near a dry creek bed. After dinner, we built a small fire, carefully rationing our limited water. Manny stared at the flames as if lost in thought. His behavior unnerved me. He was usually talkative, the life of any adventure. Now, he kept glancing at the darkness, fiddling with a phone that had no signal. Isabel looked worried, but she stayed close to him, rubbing his back as if to keep him grounded. Then, just past midnight, we heard the rumble of engines. Lights flickered across the desert floor, revealing 2 trucks approaching with headlights off, driving on a track that was barely visible. Manny stood up so fast he knocked over the camp stool. "Get down," he hissed. We crouched behind the largest rocks we could find. I was too startled to question him. The trucks stopped about 100 yards away. Armed men spilled out, talking in hushed voices. I saw glints of metal and realized they were carrying rifles. One tall man barked an order in Spanish, and Manny froze. I noticed him mouth the name Reyes. Suddenly, one of them pointed a flashlight straight at us. There was no use hiding. Manny sighed heavily and said, "I'm sorry," before stepping into the open with his hands up. We all followed, terrified, but also unwilling to abandon Manny. The tall man, who seemed to be in charge, approached, gun in hand. He had a scar across his cheek and cold eyes. "Reyes," Manny whispered, voice trembling. I can get you the money, just..." A shorter man, who Manny later identified as Moreno, stepped forward and clubbed Manny in the stomach with his rifle. Manny doubled over. Tom rushed to help but got hit from behind, the rifle's butt slamming into his ribs. The tension was suffocating. I had no idea what was happening, but these men were armed smugglers. I knew that much from the bullet-riddled sign, and Manny clearly knew them. My mind raced. What debt? Why did Manny bring us out here? They forced us to kneel, binding our wrists with rough plastic ties. Kayla let out a whimper as one of them pulled her camera out of her hands and smashed it to pieces. Isabel shouted at them to stop, but got a backhanded slap for her trouble. That moment is seared in my mind, the pure helplessness of seeing my friends assaulted. Reyes ordered Manny to stand and demanded, "Where's the payment?" Manny looked back at us, tears in his eyes, and muttered that he'd planned to meet them with contraband to settle his debt. But the criminals were done negotiating. They hauled us into the back of one of the trucks at gunpoint. By then, Tom was coughing up blood, and Manny's face was contorted with pain. Kayla and Isabel huddled close, trying to comfort each other. We drove deeper into the desert, bumping over rocky terrain. I lost track of time. The fear made every minute feel like an hour. Eventually, they stopped at a shabby shack, no more than wooden planks nailed together. The men dragged us out, cut the plastic ties from our wrists, then shoved us into the shack. A single lantern lit the interior, revealing piles of trash, a stained mattress in the corner, and an overwhelming stench of rot. They bound our hands again, this time with rope, and lined us up against a wall. Reyes wanted information from Manny. Where was the rest of the money? Who else knew about the deal? Manny pleaded that he had it under control. He just needed more time, but Reyes wasn't listening. He started pacing in front of Manny, a pistol in his hand, occasionally pressing the barrel against Manny's temple. Tom, injured as he was, tried to lunge forward, but Moreno kicked him down. It was then Manny admitted to me that he owed these smugglers a fortune after a failed trafficking deal. He had hoped the desert trip would double as a rendezvous to pay them off. "I never wanted you all involved," he choked out. "They said they'd let you go if I brought the money." My anger boiled. Manny had dragged us all into a lethal situation for his own scheme. Isabel's eyes brimmed with tears, her worst suspicions confirmed. At some point, the men stepped outside to argue amongst themselves. Through the shack's gaps, I saw flickers of flashlights darting in the night. Above, the sky was a blanket of stars, beautiful yet indifferent to our suffering. Then, abruptly, gunshots erupted. We heard yelling in Spanish, something about seeing a figure. One of the smugglers was screaming at the darkness, firing wildly. Kayla whispered, "They're spooked." She looked at the broken boards in the shack's walls, searching for any gap that might help us escape. Another shot rang out, followed by a hideous, rasping howl that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound human. The men shouted about una bestia, or a beast, but we couldn't see anything clearly. Moments later, the door burst open and Moreno rushed inside, panting. "Something's out there," he said to Reyes. "Not an animal, not a man. Something else." Reyes dismissed him angrily. "Superstition," he spat, though I could see the fear in his eyes. A sudden thump on the shack's roof made him whirl around, pistol raised. We all heard it, a scratching sound, like claws scraping across wood. For a moment, even Manny looked too frightened to speak. The next thing I knew, a figure leaned through the broken window. My heart nearly stopped. In the dim lantern light, I could make out a face that looked eerily like one of the smugglers. But the real smuggler was standing in the room. The face in the window twisted into an unnatural grin, then vanished. A second later, it reappeared at another gap in the boards, this time letting out a low, rattling laugh. Reyes fired his gun in that direction. The bullet splintered the wood, but whatever was there was gone. "We need to leave," Moreno urged. Reyes refused, furious that Manny hadn't given him the money. He spun around and slashed Manny across the side with a knife, not too deep, but enough to make Manny scream and collapse. Blood began to stain Manny's shirt. Isabel cried out, and Kayla and I struggled against the rope to help him. Tom tried once more to rise, but Moreno smashed him down, pressing a boot on his back. Screeches erupted outside, inhuman, echoing in the desert night. I heard panicked shouts. 2 more of the criminals ran off, either chasing or being chased by that shape-shifting creature. Reyes barked orders, but no one was listening. The men had lost their nerve. In the confusion, Kayla tugged her hands free, having worked the rope loose. She'd signaled me quietly, and as Reyes stormed outside, she hurried to untie Tom, Isabel, and me. Manny lay on the floor, bleeding. We helped him up, wincing at his ragged breathing. Shouts and sporadic gunfire rang out nearby. The horror in the desert overshadowed our fear of the smugglers for a moment. We had to get out. We slipped out a side door, carrying Manny's weight between us. The night was bitterly cold, the moon high. Sand and small stones crunched under our boots. I spotted 2 or 3 men about 50 yards away, scanning the darkness with flashlights. One of them, possibly Reyes, saw us. He raised his gun, and I expected to feel a bullet at any second. But just then, a tall, misshapen silhouette sprang between the cacti, drawing their fire. We seized the opportunity, running without a clear direction, only that we had to put distance between us and our kidnappers. We didn't stop until Manny's legs gave out, and we nearly dropped him. Tom, still favoring his bruised ribs, coughed, trying to catch his breath. Kayla was shaking uncontrollably. Isabel pulled Manny's shirt aside, revealing a serious stab wound, but not immediately fatal. We tore strips of fabric to bandage him the best we could. The desert night was eerily silent now, as if every living thing had fled or was in hiding. We pressed on, hoping to stumble upon a dirt road or any sign of civilization. The moonlight illuminated bizarre shapes of cacti, their arms reaching into the sky like silent sentinels. We trudged for what felt like hours. Manny was weakening, and Tom was getting surlier by the minute, snapping that Manny had set us all up. Isabel was torn between anger and desperation to keep Manny alive. I tried to keep the group focused on surviving, promising we'd rip Manny apart later if we made it out at all. Kayla mostly stayed quiet, eyes scanning every shadow. Just before dawn, we noticed Kayla wasn't behind us. In a panic, we backtracked, calling her name in hushed tones. Then we saw drag marks in the sand leading into a narrow canyon. My stomach flipped. We followed them, hearts pounding. The faintest glow of sunrise lit the rocks as we stumbled upon Kayla. sprawled near a thick cluster of cacti. She was alive, but had scratches on her arms and legs. She trembled, rambling that she'd seen me, my exact face, beckoning her away from the group. Yet, I was nowhere near her at the time. We helped Kayla up, but a chill ran through me. If she'd seen me, then that thing had mimicked my appearance. None of us spoke it aloud, but we all thought the same word, skinwalker. Local legends, old stories of shapeshifters that could take the form of humans or animals. Kayla looked at me with unsteady eyes and said, "I heard your voice. I swear it was you." Tom's flashlight flickered, then died altogether. That was when another silhouette emerged from behind the cacti. It looked like Tom, identical height, build, even the same shape of face. But Tom was standing right next to me, battered yet alive. The double let out a wheezing sound. Its eyes reflecting a dull, feral light, it lunged at Manny, as though sensing his injured state. A guttural screech filled the air. Isabel screamed, and I brought my arms up in defense. Tom tried to jab at it with a sharp rock, but the creature moved unnaturally fast. Its body jerked like a puppet on tangled strings. It scratched Manny's wounded side, making him howl in pain. Instinct took over. I tackled the thing, felt it struggle with inhuman strength beneath me. Its skin was cold, clammy. Tom slashed at it with the rock, and Kayla struck it with a heavy branch she'd grabbed off the ground. The creature shrieked, a sound that rattled my teeth. Then it scrambled away, retreating into the pre-dawn shadows. The stench it left behind made me gag, like rotted meat baking in the sun. With the sun finally rising, we limped forward, Manny moaning with each step. I held one of his arms over my shoulder while Isabel supported the other side. Tom scouted ahead, every now and then cursing under his breath about Manny's betrayal. Kayla walked at the rear, eyes still wide and alert, as though expecting the creature to return at any moment. At last, we spotted a dirt road cutting through the desert. We followed it until we heard an engine. A white and green border patrol truck appeared in a swirl of dust, the officer inside rolling to a stop when he saw our condition. He jumped out, demanded to know what happened. We had no idea how to explain. Manny passed out, so the officer radioed for medical help. Once we were safe in the truck, Kayla broke down sobbing, and Tom just kept shaking his head in disbelief. Paramedics arrived, loading Manny onto a stretcher. They questioned us, and eventually, law enforcement got involved. We told them about the smugglers, the kidnapping, the shack in the desert. By the time a search party went out, Reyes, Moreno, and their men were gone. They found empty bullet casings, a shattered lantern, bloodstains that could have been from Manny or someone else. But no one was there. No sign of that night's horror, supernatural or otherwise. Manny survived, though he needed surgery to close his stab wound. When the authorities dug deeper, they found evidence of Manny's involvement with trafficking. He faced charges that cost him more time in a courtroom than any hospital bed. Isabel left him not long after, her trust shattered. She told me, "I loved him, but I can't forgive him for risking our lives." Kayla recovered from her physical scrapes, but she still insists she saw a shapeshifter out there, something that wore my face like a mask. Tom, ironically, refuses to believe any supernatural angle. He thinks it was some insane criminal messing with us. He won't talk about it in detail, though I catch him, sometimes, eyes lost in thought, replaying everything in his head. As for me, I've tried to go back to a normal life. I no longer lead guided tours. I can't look at the desert sunset without remembering Manny's screams and that awful grin on a face that wasn't quite human. Sometimes, I wake in the night thinking I hear a rattling laugh outside my window or see a shadow flit across the wall. My therapist calls it post-traumatic stress, but a small part of me wonders if it's something else. A reminder that out there in the Sonoran Desert, some ancient evil still roams. I can't say for sure what truly hunted us that night. Maybe the police were right to chalk it up to criminals driven mad by greed and desperation. Maybe Kayla's stories of a skinwalker have merit. A warning that not all predators walk on two legs like you and me. Whatever the truth, I know this. I will never set foot in that stretch of the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument again. My name is Eli Sandoval, and that is the story of how a simple trip into the desert became a nightmare I still can't escape. My name is Jonas Larson. I'm 35 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened not long ago in a remote corner of the Coconino National Forest in Arizona. I'm a freelance writer by trade, and I spend most of my time living out of my RV, traveling from place to place, chasing inspiration. I've been on the road ever since a car crash took my parents and younger sister from me when I was 20. I was the only survivor. Sometimes it feels like I can't stop moving. If I stay still too long, the memories catch up. I drove my battered Class C motorhome into the forest just as the sun was slipping behind the ponderosa pines. The smell of pine needles and cold earth was comforting. I'd chosen this remote spot hoping for solitude to finish a series of personal travel essays. Stories about wilderness, the people I meet, and how places can shape a person's healing. I had no idea how deeply my own limits would be tested. I arrived at a half-empty campground near the far edge of the forest, well off the main road. A few other RVs and trucks were scattered around, but there was enough space for everyone to have privacy. I found a level spot beneath a stand of tall pines and parked. The moment I stepped out, I felt a chill on the breeze. It was late autumn, and the nights in northern Arizona can get surprisingly cold. While I was setting up, a forest ranger approached on foot, her uniform dusty from the trails. She looked to be in her early 40s, lean, with weathered skin from long hours in the sun. She introduced herself as Ranger Annette Ruiz. "Mind if I ask what brings you out here alone?" she said, scanning my RV. I explained my freelance work, that I was just looking for a quiet place to write. She tilted her head thoughtfully. "We've had some, strange reports recently. Some folks have heard howling late at night. Could just be wolves passing through, but it's best to stay cautious. Also," she hesitated, then added, "there've been a few unexplained animal attacks in the area. Small game, mostly, but the circumstances are odd. If you hear anything strange, call the ranger station." She handed me a card with a landline number. I thanked her, thinking it was standard ranger talk. She left me to finish setting up. The sun had fully set by then, and as darkness settled over the campground, I turned on the small propane heater inside my RV. I wrote for a while, describing the crisp air and the silence between the towering pines. That night, all I heard was the wind rattling through the needles. It felt peaceful, though a small part of me, a leftover from my anxious mind, kept waiting for something to go wrong. The next day, I decided to explore some of the narrow roads winding deeper into the forest, searching for scenic overlooks. I hopped in my RV and drove slowly, avoiding the worst of the potholes. After about half an hour of twisting roads, I came upon a big old bus parked in a clearing. It had been converted into a kind of makeshift home. A metal awning was extended from its side, shading a folding table and chair. A man in his 60s poked his head out when I stopped. "Come on out, I don't bite," he joked. Introduced himself as Harold Knowles, but said everyone called him Hal. He'd been out here off and on for a couple months, fishing and camping. He invited me to sit for coffee. As he poured us both a cup, he started rambling about conspiracies, secret government bases in the forest, hidden cryptids, and so on. Most of it sounded like tall tales, but his tone shifted when he mentioned the howls. He leaned forward, voice dropping. "I saw something the other night. Huge. On 2 legs, covered in fur. Looked like a wolf standing upright. I know how that sounds, but..." He trailed off, looking genuinely rattled. I tried to be polite, but the skeptic in me took over. I smiled and said, "I'm sure there's an explanation." He shrugged as if used to disbelief, then told me to watch my back at night. On my way out, Hal called after me. "Don't wander too far from help, you hear? We're outnumbered by everything in these pines." Back at my campsite, I typed up some notes about Hal's story. In my experience, local legends often say more about people's fears than reality. I focused on the practical side. Maybe large coyotes or wolves had come closer due to a shortage of prey. Ranger Ruiz's warning and Hal's tall tales could be connected to the same phenomenon. A pack of animals, not a mythical monster. That evening, a young camper passed by my site as I was grilling a quick dinner on a small portable stove. He looked tired, maybe in his mid-20s, with a big hiking pack. I offered him some water. He thanked me and said he was on a multi-day trek across a section of the forest. I asked if he'd heard any weird howling. He nodded with an uneasy laugh. "Last night, I heard something that didn't sound like coyotes or wolves. More like a moaning growl." He tried to mimic it and failed, then shook his head. "Never heard an animal make a noise like that." As he headed off, my confidence wavered. The rest of that day, I wrote in my RV, occasionally glancing out the window at the silhouettes of the pines, half expecting to see movement among them. I ate a light dinner, locked the RV door, and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I jolted awake to a heavy thump on the driver's side of the RV. My heart pounded. I listened, hearing only the wind. Then came a scratching noise, like claws or nails dragging across the metal. I slid out of bed, turned on the small interior light, and grabbed the baseball bat I keep for emergencies. Cautiously, I pulled back the curtain on the window. Nothing. The darkness outside was complete except for faint moonlight filtering through the branches. My breath fogged on the cold glass. I tapped the side of the RV lightly with the bat, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. After a few tense minutes, all was silent. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I did a walk around and saw 4 long scratch marks on the RV's lower side. They were arranged in a parallel line, as if something with sharp claws had dragged them purposefully. I felt the indentation with my fingers, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a bear, but black bears in Arizona aren't usually found this far in the pines without leaving footprints. I found no tracks, just damp pine needles. I decided to find Ranger Ruiz and report the incident. The official campground area where she stayed wasn't too far by road. I drove there, but another ranger on duty said Ruiz was on patrol. He did, however, take notes when I showed him pictures of the scratches. The ranger asked me if I wanted to relocate to a busier part of the forest. I was tempted, but my stubborn streak kicked in. I was here to write, and it felt foolish to run because of a few scratches. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself by exploring an overlooked trail. Despite my attempts to remain calm, a prickle of unease clung to me. A deep guilt I've carried for years flared up. I was alone again, just like when my family died. My old fear bubbled to the surface, being powerless, left behind. The wind rustled through the pines, and I half expected to hear that scraping noise again. Around dusk, I got back to my RV. A note was pinned under my windshield wiper. It read, "Keep lights on at night. Don't go out alone." A.R. Ranger Ruiz must have come by. Something about her cryptic message made my stomach churn with worry. She wasn't messing around. If the official stance was that there might be wolves or a dangerous animal, Why not simply close the area? I realized with a jolt that maybe she suspected something beyond a typical predator. The second night was worse. I secured every window and door, kept a flashlight at arm's reach, and turned on all exterior lights. Around 11, I heard it. Distant at first, a long, mournful howl. I'd heard wolf howls on nature documentaries, but this was different, deeper, with a guttural undertone that sent a jolt of terror through me. My heater rattled as I jumped to my feet, scanning outside through the RV windows. The howling came closer, echoing among the trees. Then I heard heavy footsteps circling around the vehicle, crunching pine needles underfoot. The lights outside flickered, maybe a loose connection. In that split second of darkness, something slammed the side of the RV, hard enough to rock it on its springs. I fumbled for my baseball bat and the large flashlight, heart pounding so loudly it felt like it was in my ears. I heard snarling, guttural breathing, like a massive animal trying to sniff me out through the walls. I switched on a spotlight I keep for emergencies and pointed it through a side window. The beam caught a glimpse of a shape, tall, hunched, with patches of matted fur. Its eyes reflected the light in an eerie amber glow. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. Then the creature let out a scream, half an animal roar, half a human wail. I nearly dropped the flashlight. It lunged at the window, cracking the glass before retreating into darkness. My chest felt like it would explode. I don't remember how long it circled my RV, but eventually it disappeared. I stayed up until sunrise, trembling, repeating to myself that I had to keep it out, that I couldn't let my fear overwhelm me. I replayed memories of my family in that car crash, the twisted metal and shattered glass. I felt that same helplessness, but I fought it, telling myself I wasn't going to be a victim again. At first light, I stumbled outside, expecting to find more scratches, but this time they were deep gouges in the metal, and one window was partially cracked. Whatever I saw, it was strong enough to nearly shatter safety glass. I was done pretending. Gathering my wallet, keys, and phone, I hopped into the driver's seat, intending to leave immediately. But the moment I tried to drive forward, the RV thumped and listed to one side. 2 of my tires were flat, shredded by what looked like claws. I grabbed my phone. No signal. My only connection to the outside world was an old CB radio I kept for emergencies. I darted back inside and powered it on, scanning channels. I could only pick up static. After several frantic attempts, I heard a crackling voice, but it was too faint to make out. A storm front was rolling in, thick gray clouds swirling above the pines. My luck couldn't have been worse. I calmed myself, rummaging for the first aid kit and the small revolver I keep locked up for protection when traveling in remote areas. I'd never fired it at anything but a paper target, but I was grateful to have it now. That was when I noticed footsteps in the pine needles again, human-shaped footprints laced with deep claws. My breath hitched. It was as though a man had walked barefoot, except the track had savage, elongated nails. Realizing I needed help, I decided to hike toward the ranger station or at least find Ranger Ruiz. I packed a day's worth of water, some energy bars, the revolver, and a hunting knife. Before setting out, I left a note taped to my RV's door. Jonas Larson. My tires were slashed. Went to find help. If you see this and I'm not back, call for rescue. I was shaken, but determined not to let panic consume me. The forest was cold, damp with the approach of rain. Wind hissed through the branches overhead, sounding too much like a whisper. I kept replaying the monster's howl in my head, half convinced I'd lost my mind. About an hour into my trek, I found an old game trail that seemed to lead downhill, possibly toward the main roads. Partway along, I spotted a scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch. It was dark green and looked like part of a uniform patch. My heart dropped. It might have belonged to Ranger Ruiz. Following the trail further, I saw more signs of a struggle. Scuffed dirt, broken branches, a few drops of dried blood on pine needles. No sign of a body or footprints heading away. A wave of dread nearly buckled my knees. I forced myself to keep going, my breath coming in tight gasps. Then thunder rumbled overhead, and the sky opened up. Rain hammered the forest. Visibility dropped as fog rolled in among the trees. I lost the trail, stumbling between thick trunks and mossy stones. My sense of direction faltered. I flicked on my flashlight, trying not to think about the wolf thing possibly stalking me. Every time a branch snapped, I whipped around, revolver raised, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I couldn't tell you how long I wandered. Eventually, I found a dirt service road, rutted and muddy. Relief washed over me. This might lead to the ranger station. I started walking along it as rain continued to pour, soaking me to the bone. Lightning illuminated the forest in white flashes. After another half-mile or so, I saw a faint glow through the trees. I crept closer and recognized the battered bus Hal had converted into his home. Except it looked ransacked now. Windows smashed, the makeshift awning torn off. My stomach clenched. "Hal?" I called, fighting the urge to keep silent. I figured if anything was around, it already knew I was here. Inside, I found Hal lying on the floor, badly injured. His left arm was slashed, and he had bite marks on his shoulder. Yet he was alive, muttering something about the beast and "I told you" in a delirious voice. I tried to help him, used my first aid kit to wrap his wounds as best I could. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me close. "It's out there," he rasped, standing on two legs. It got my dog. Then it came for me. I saw its eyes. I shot at it, but it ran off. I told Hal I'd get him out, that we just needed to reach the ranger station or find working transportation. I asked if his bus could drive. He shook his head. Whatever attacked him also tore at the bus's engine, severing wires. We were stuck. Another crash of thunder rattled the windows. Hal's eyes darted around the interior. "It always comes back. I saw it just before you showed up." He wasn't in any condition to move quickly, but staying put felt like a death sentence. I scanned the place for anything useful. Hal had a hunting rifle leaning against a chair, a few boxes of ammunition, though most looked wet or damaged. He also had a CB radio, but it was smashed. Lightning flashed again, and an enormous silhouette flickered across the bus's shattered windshield. Hal gripped the rifle with trembling hands. I raised my revolver, heart hammering. For a moment, all I heard was the thumping of rain on the metal roof. Then the door to the bus rattled as something pounded on it from outside. The door nearly came off its hinges. Hal screamed and fired through the door blindly. Splinters flew. The pounding stopped, replaced by an unearthly growl. The door was torn open, revealing the creature hunched in the rain. Pale lightning illuminated gray, matted fur, long arms, and a muzzle lined with yellowed teeth. Its eyes glowed in the flicker of the storm. It let out a roar, and I could smell its rancid breath. I fired my revolver twice, the noise deafening in the confined space. Hal fired the rifle again, the shot going wild. The creature lurched backward, possibly hit. It snarled, clawing the metal, leaving deep gouges. Then it took off into the downpour, letting out a series of howls that made my blood freeze. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep my gun raised. Hal was sobbing, clutching his wounded arm. "You hit it," he mumbled. And I wasn't sure if that was a hopeful guess or if he'd really seen the bullet connect. I knew we'd just gotten lucky, that we might have driven it away temporarily. We couldn't stay in the bus. It would be back. Hal's wound looked nasty, and I didn't know how far I'd be able to walk with him, but we had no choice. I wrapped Hal's arm tighter, slung it over my shoulder, and together we stumbled out into the storm. The mud sucked at our boots as we limped along the road. Each flash of lightning made me fear seeing that monstrous silhouette again. Hal's breathing became ragged. I tried to reassure him. Just a little farther, I lied, not knowing if we had a mile or 10 to the station. At some point, my muscles burned so badly I had to stop. Hal collapsed against a fallen log, moaning in pain. Rain dripped off my hood, and every shadow seemed to move. Then we heard that same guttural howl, closer than before. It echoed in the pines, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. Hal gripped his rifle, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "I can't go any farther," he rasped, trembling. Lightning flashed, revealing the creature about 30 yards behind us on the road, half hidden by trees. I could make out the glint of its eyes. It let out a low rumble of a growl. Fight or flight kicked in. I knew if we tried to run, Hal wouldn't stand a chance. I raised my revolver, bracing against the log, and fired again, aiming at the eyes. The shot sparked in the darkness. The creature roared, advanced a few steps, then hesitated. Hal fired the rifle. It let out a guttural snarl, as though injured, and swerved to the side, disappearing behind pines. I helped Hal to his feet. "We can't stay here," I told him, and he gave a weak nod. We staggered along the road, the storm finally beginning to taper off. After what felt like hours, the headlights of a vehicle cut through the trees ahead. 2 beams of light bounced over the muddy road. A pickup truck. Relief washed over me like a wave. The truck pulled up and a figure jumped out. It was Ranger Ruiz, wearing a drenched jacket and carrying a first aid kit. Another ranger sat behind the wheel. She rushed to Hal, checking his pulse. "I got your distress call," she told me, though I wasn't sure how much of my frantic CB transmissions she'd actually heard. They ushered us into the truck's cabin. I couldn't stop shaking. Whether from shock or the cold, I didn't know. On the drive out, I explained through chattering teeth what had happened. The monster, the attacks, the howling. Ranger Ruiz listened calmly, though her expression told me she knew more than she let on. Hal drifted in and out of consciousness. The other ranger radioed for medical support, describing Hal's injuries. By dawn, we reached a larger ranger station where they transferred Hal to an ambulance. I was taken to a back room, given dry clothes, a blanket, and a cup of hot coffee. Ranger Ruiz sat down across from me, exhausted. "We've had a handful of strange incidents lately," she admitted softly, "but nothing as extreme as what you're describing. Still, the injuries speak for themselves." I told her about my RV, the shredded tires, the claw marks. She promised a team would check it out, but said it might take time. My words tumbled out in a rush. How I'd seen it clearly, how it stood on 2 legs, how it was more than an animal. She gently placed a hand on my shoulder, telling me I was safe now. When law enforcement arrived, they wanted a full statement. They found Hal's bus and verified the damage, footprints, and bullet holes. They also discovered my RV with matching claw marks, but no sign of the creature. Just large wolf-like tracks in the muddy ground. Officially, it was labeled a probable bear or wolf attack. Off the record, the rangers seemed unnerved. Hal survived, though he needed multiple stitches and was kept under observation. I never heard the exact details of what wildlife officials concluded. No definitive corpse of an animal was recovered, and no traps yielded results. Some said it was a rogue wolf, possibly rabid. Others blamed a large black bear. No one but Hal and I seemed ready to describe it as part man, part beast. I left Arizona a week later in a borrowed vehicle. I haven't been back to the Coconino National Forest since. I still write, but now I shy away from remote solitude. Late at night, I sometimes dream of lightning flashes revealing a tall, fur-covered shape just beyond the tree line. In these nightmares, I'm trapped in my RV, tires slashed, hearing that awful howl as the walls shake. I suppose the official record will never confirm a werewolf-like creature in northern Arizona, but I know what I saw, what tried to tear through the metal skin of my RV, what left me trembling in a downpour while I fought to keep Hal and myself alive. Maybe it was an ancient beast, some cursed shapeshifter, or maybe it was just a freakishly large wolf with cunning beyond reason. Whatever it was, it forced me to face the terror of being alone in a way I never had before. And though I survived, I carry the scars of that encounter, not on my body, but in the restless nights when I close my eyes and still see those glowing amber eyes in every shadow. My name is Tessa Morgan. I'm 28 years old, and this happened a few weeks ago in a lonely stretch of the Painted Desert near the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. I should probably start by saying I'm a traveling hospice nurse, or rather, I was, until my last patient passed away under my care. She was an older woman named Rose, and I'd grown close to her over the year I looked after her. When she died, I felt like I'd failed. I took a leave of absence, packed up my modest RV, and decided I needed space to think, to breathe. The Painted Desert attracted me for its beauty. Rolling hills of pink and red stone, scattered petrified logs that glitter in the sunlight. But once I arrived, I discovered a deeper quiet than I'd expected. A quiet so absolute it magnified my thoughts. I parked in a designated but remote RV camping area, about a mile off the main road that few tourists used. I wanted solitude. I got it. During my first evening, I set out a folding chair beside my RV to watch the sunset. There was a biting wind that rustled through the scrub. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the colors in the desert intensified, bleeding purple into red into dark blue. I felt a momentary peace, as if I might finally be able to let go of the heaviness pressing on my chest since Rose's final breath. A friendly ranger named Brian Willis showed up at my site just before full darkness fell. He was in his late 40s, had an easy smile, and carried a flashlight that he flicked on and off as he spoke. "Evening," he said, nodding at my RV. "Just wanted to let you know we've had some folks reporting odd noises at night. Could be the wind, could be something else. But if you need anything, there's a ranger station a few miles west, though service is spotty." He handed me a small card with a phone number on it. "Better to call if you hear or see anything unusual." I asked him what he meant by something else, and he shrugged, almost embarrassed. "Local ghost stories, I guess. It's the desert. Folks' imaginations run wild." Before I could press him, he excused himself and headed off to check another site. Nighttime in the desert revealed a sky brimming with stars, but it also brought an unnerving silence. I thought I heard a low moan in the distance once or twice, but it could have been the wind funneling through the canyons. I tucked myself into my RV bed, feeling the chill air creep through the windows. When I awoke around midnight, I couldn't remember why. Maybe a dream. I drifted back to sleep, half convinced I was hearing footsteps outside. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a trick of my tired mind. Around noon the next day, I decided to walk one of the park's shorter interpretive trails. As I locked up the RV, I noticed footprints in the dusty gravel near the door. They looked small, almost like a woman's, but partially smeared by the wind. It struck me as odd. Brian's footprints would have been larger, and I hadn't seen any other campers parked nearby. Brushing off a flicker of unease, I set off on foot, figuring that if anyone had stopped by, maybe they'd left a pamphlet or something. I didn't find anything. On the trail, I ran into a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn Green. She was about 60, with kind eyes and a sadness I instantly recognized. People in grief tend to spot each other that way, like a subtle vibe. We chatted about the rock formations, the unearthly colors of the desert. Then she softly mentioned she was out here after losing her grown son in an accident 2 years prior. I told her about losing my patient Rose and how I felt I hadn't done enough. She gave me a sympathetic look. No matter the circumstances, we never think we've done enough. Then her voice lowered. I've been coming to this desert on and off, hoping its stillness might help me heal. But the nights have been strange. I heard voices last night, maybe just the wind, I'm not sure. A haunted look flickered in her gaze. I sometimes think I hear my son calling to me. Her words stuck with me. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner of soup in my RV, I couldn't shake the image of Evelyn's sorrowful eyes. The painted desert was beautiful, but could also be lonely enough to conjure illusions. As the night wore on, the wind picked up again, moaning across the open land. Somewhere around 11, I heard a faint knock on the RV's door. I froze, heart hammering. When I finally gathered the courage to check, no one was there. I scanned the area with a flashlight. Then I saw them. Red handprints smudged on the driver's side window. Each print was about the size of a small woman's hand, slightly angled, as if someone had pressed their palms against the glass. My stomach clenched. There was no one in sight, but the prints looked fresh. The wind would have dried them quickly if they'd been blood, but it could have been dust or mud tinted by red desert clay. Either way, it was terrifying. I didn't sleep much that night. When dawn finally broke, I hurried outside to see if the handprints were still there. They were, faded but visible. I paced around the RV, calling out to see if anyone was near. Only wind and silence. I thought about driving away, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was pride, or the feeling I had to face whatever was happening. I told myself there might be a rational explanation. Local pranksters, or even Evelyn, disoriented by her grief. But none of that felt right. Midday, a young park volunteer stopped by, handing out pamphlets about petrified wood preservation. He was cheerful, said his name was Dylan, then added with a grin, "You know the local legend, right? People say if you take so much as a pebble of petrified wood, you'll get haunted by ghosts. The rangers get letters all the time from tourists mailing back wood they pocketed, claiming it cursed them." I forced a laugh, assured him I hadn't taken anything. He winked. "Good. We call that the petrified curse." Kinda spooky. Then he hopped on his ATV and buzzed away, leaving me feeling unsettled. That afternoon, while journaling, I decided to walk near the famous petrified logs. They looked like ancient fallen trees, the wood turned to stone and quartz. Spectacular but silent, almost ominous in how they dotted the desert. As dusk approached, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned, heart thumping, but saw only shimmering heat waves. Still, I felt watched. Back at my RV, I found new footprints circling the vehicle. They were distinct, narrow, likely female, the same size as those by the door. My pulse raced. Why? Who? I grabbed the phone number Brian gave me and tried to call, but my phone only gave me static. The nearest landline was back by the visitor center, miles away. I considered driving there, but the sun was already dipping below the horizon, the sky a spectacular swirl of pink and orange. A heavy sense of dread anchored me, as if leaving now might lead me into something worse on the dark roads. As night fell, I double-checked that the RV doors were locked. The wind howled fiercely, rattling the windows. For a moment, I thought I heard soft weeping. Telling myself it was the wind, I settled into bed, hugging my knees, the small overhead light casting harsh shadows. Somewhere near midnight, I jolted awake to the sound of footsteps inside the RV. My heart hammered. The footsteps were light, deliberate, moving toward the bed. I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand and flicked it on, shining it around frantically. Empty. No one there. Yet the feeling of a presence was overwhelming. The hair on my arms stood on end. I whispered, "Who's there?" My voice trembled. The only reply was a faint, mournful sob that came from somewhere near the kitchenette, followed by a rapid temperature drop. I could see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. My mind raced. Hallucination? No, it felt too real. I inched toward the RV's small kitchen area, flashlight trembling in my grip. Then, in the reflection of the stainless steel sink, I saw her. A woman in a dusty old-fashioned wedding gown, her veil partially covering her face. Her eyes were dark hollows, her skin ashen. I spun around, but the space behind me was empty. When I turned back to the sink, her reflection was gone. The only evidence of her presence was the echo of that weeping and my own terror. I didn't sleep again. By dawn, I was shaky and exhausted. Determined to get help, I tried my phone. Still no signal. I decided to head out in the RV, at least drive to a better vantage point. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered, coughed, and refused to start. Checking under the hood, I found nothing obvious, but I'm hardly a mechanic. With no luck there, I grabbed my water bottle and decided to walk to where I knew a ranger contact post might be. On the trail, a gust of wind blew around me, carrying faint sobs. Panic stabbed at me. I quickened my pace. Pale sunlight glinted off distant petrified logs. The dryness in my mouth tasted like dust and adrenaline. After nearly an hour of walking, I ran into Evelyn Green again, though she was a half-mile off the main trail, staring at the horizon. Her eyes were puffy from crying. Before I could say anything, she asked, "Tessa, did you hear it too, the crying?" I nodded. She explained that she couldn't sleep, that she kept hearing a woman's voice calling out. Her expression was full of raw fear. It sounded so close, like someone right outside my trailer. That was enough for me. I told her we should head together to find Ranger Willis, or at least a phone. As we moved, clouds gathered, casting a dreary gray over the painted desert. The wind picked up, swirling sand around our ankles. Evelyn stumbled, and we paused so she could catch her breath. I glanced at the horizon and saw a figure, pale, motionless. At first, it looked like a trick of the light. Then, lightning cracked in the sky, momentarily illuminating the shape of the woman in the wedding gown. She was far off, but unmistakable. Evelyn saw it too, her mouth falling open. We resumed walking with a newfound urgency. The figure vanished, reappearing now and then whenever lightning flashed. We never heard thunder, just the crackle of light and an ever-present howling wind. By the time we reached a dirt access road that supposedly led to a ranger post, the ghostly bride was gone. No one was at the small ranger hut, the door locked. Wind battered the structure, making it groan. Evelyn and I took shelter under the eaves, trying to decide our next move. She was almost in tears, telling me how the footsteps and crying reminded her of those final weeks with her son before his accident, like a literal haunting of her regret. That struck a chord. I was haunted too. Haunted by Rose's face the day she died, my feeling of not doing enough to ease her pain. Night crept in quickly. There was nowhere to go but back to our campsites or stay in the abandoned hut's meager shelter. Evelyn insisted on going to her trailer for some medication she needed. I insisted on not splitting up, so I walked with her. The wind intensified, whipping stinging dust in our faces. We passed bizarre rock formations and petrified logs that seemed to glow under the swirl of the storm clouds. About halfway there, the temperature dropped sharply again. I almost expected to see my breath. Then, from behind a large petrified log, the bride stepped out. She wore a torn, dusty gown, stained with desert sand. Her veil drifted in the wind, revealing a sorrowful face. Her eyes locked on me with such an intensity that I felt pinned in place. Evelyn grasped my arm, shaking. The bride raised a pale hand, beckoning us. I heard a voice in my head, or maybe it was real. It whispered, "Help me." The agony in those two words matched the ache I'd carried for months, the powerless feeling as Rose slipped away, despite all my care. "Help me," she repeated, stepping closer. Her feet hovered just above the ground, stirring dust but leaving no footprints. Evelyn let out a choked sob. I forced myself to speak. "What do you want?" My words sounded pathetic against the gale. The bride's expression contorted in grief, and I thought she might speak again. Instead, she vanished as lightning illuminated the sky. But we knew she was still near. We sensed her presence, pressing like a weight on our chests. When we reached Evelyn's trailer, the door was ajar, which she swore she'd locked. Inside, the place was in disarray, her belongings scattered, pictures knocked off shelves. Even more unsettling were the wet footprints on the floor, as though someone had trailed water across it. Evelyn started to hyperventilate. I helped her sit, fetched her medication from a cupboard. That was when a red handprint appeared on the inside of the window before my eyes, materializing as if an invisible hand pressed itself against the glass. I knew we couldn't stay here. Evelyn wasn't in any shape to walk miles in the dark storm, but I refused to let the ghost pin us down. I rummaged for Evelyn's car keys, hoping we could drive out. We dashed outside to her small SUV. The engine turned over, thank God. I hopped in, motioning for Evelyn to follow. She got into the passenger seat, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What about your RV?" she asked. I started driving, the wipers barely clearing the sand and drizzle. "I can come back for it later," I said. My heart pounded with every gust. I aimed for the main road that would lead us to the more populated side of the park, or possibly a town. We didn't get far. Barely 5 minutes down the dirt track, the SUV's headlights illuminated the bride standing in the middle of the road, head bowed. I slammed on the brakes, skidding in the loose gravel. She raised her eyes, dark hollows that bored into me. It was like a wave of sorrow poured into my mind, memories of Rose's final hours, her labored breathing, my own helplessness. Evelyn shrieked. The engine sputtered and died. Frantic, I tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't respond. The bride drifted closer, arms outstretched. The wind roared, buffeting the SUV. The windows rattled. Evelyn fumbled at the door handle, as though trying to flee, but I gripped her arm, refusing to let her stumble into that phantom's embrace. Suddenly, the bride vanished, reappeared on the passenger side, pressing her pale face against the window. Evelyn screamed, backing away in terror. In an act of desperation, I turned the key again and pumped the gas. The engine caught. I hit the accelerator, swerving around the ghost. The bride flickered like static and then was gone. I drove until we reached a paved road, only stopping when I saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. It was Ranger Brian in a pickup truck, accompanied by another ranger. They could see we were hysterical. They guided us back to a well-lit service area. Once inside, I collapsed onto a bench. Evelyn clutched a cup of water with trembling hands. Brian looked both concerned and like a man who'd heard a few too many desert ghost stories. I told him everything, from the footprints to the ghost's face. He listened, not once accusing me of lying. When I finished, he let out a breath and admitted, "There's a local legend about a woman who died decades ago on the old highway, searching for her fiancé. Some say she roams the painted desert, drawn to those who carry loss." That last phrase struck me like a blow. She was drawn to me, maybe to Evelyn as well, because we were wounded souls, wrestling with guilt or grief. We stayed in that service area until dawn, a rickety coffee machine providing us with heat and the illusion of comfort. The next morning, sunlight revealed the desert in all its stark beauty, yet the memory of the ghostly bride remained as real as the ground beneath my feet. Evelyn decided to leave Arizona for good, traveling to stay with relatives. I promised to keep in touch, though I suspect she'd rather forget everything that happened. I, on the other hand, returned with Brian to fetch my RV. It took a mechanic's tow truck to fix the engine, but eventually I got it running. I found no new footprints that day, no new handprints. The bride seemed to have retreated, her hold on me weakened, maybe because I was no longer carrying the same overwhelming burden of shame. In a strange way, seeing her anguish forced me to confront my own. I realized I had to forgive myself for what happened to Rose. Before leaving the painted desert, I stood in the place where I'd first seen the bride, among the petrified logs. I said a quiet goodbye, not certain if I was speaking to her or to my own regrets. The wind gently stirred the dust, no howling this time, no ghostly figure. I choose to believe I helped set her free by acknowledging her grief and my own. Or maybe I just set myself free. I wish I could say I'm healed now, that I sleep soundly every night. I don't. But I do know that place changed me. In the painted desert, I faced something inexplicable, something shaped by sorrow and longing. Whether she was truly a spirit or an echo conjured by the land, I can't say for sure. But I've learned that we carry more than we realize. Our guilt, our regrets, our love for those we've lost. Sometimes those burdens manifest in terrifying ways, and sometimes we have to look them in the eye. A bride in a torn gown, or a memory of a patient named Rose, to find a measure of peace. I drove away from Arizona at sunrise, the endless expanse of desert behind me. I'm not sure if the bride still wanders the painted desert, pressing her red handprints against unsuspecting travelers' windows, or if my encounter somehow brought her rest. All I know is that she left me with a warning and a gift, the understanding that our grief is powerful enough to haunt us, unless we find the courage to face it head-on. And in facing it, maybe we can set both ourselves and the ghosts we carry free. My name is Logan Price. I'm 31 years old, and this happened early last spring in a remote corner of the Tonto National Forest in Arizona. I used to work in corporate marketing, but the stress nearly buried me, so I quit and followed my passion for wildlife photography. I bought a small RV to travel full-time, chasing pictures of elusive animals in beautiful places. I craved the quiet, the sense of discovery you get when you're out there with nothing but your camera and the wilderness. But last spring, I got more than I bargained for. I drove my battered RV down a series of dirt roads that seemed to snake endlessly through pine trees and rocky ridges. The forest felt deep and secretive, its canopy thick enough in places to block out the sun. I'd come to capture images of black bears just emerging from winter dens. Tonto National Forest, especially near the Mogollon Rim, was rumored to have incredible biodiversity. Cougars, elk, and if local legends were to be believed, something far stranger. I arrived at my chosen campsite late in the afternoon. It wasn't an official campground, just a flat patch of earth near a cluster of pines with a narrow creek about 50 yards behind it. The moment I stepped out of the RV, I noticed how still the air was. No birds, no breeze. It was early spring, but there was a light dusting of snow in the shadows. The quiet was pleasant at first, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I set about leveling my RV and preparing a simple dinner on a propane stove. As I was tidying up, a forest ranger's truck pulled into the clearing, crunching over gravel. A woman in her 40s stepped out. She was tall, with her dark hair in a low ponytail, and wore a badge reading M. Caldwell. She greeted me with a small wave. "Evening. Everything okay out here?" I explained what I was doing. Wildlife photography, black bears specifically. She looked around at my solitary campsite and frowned. "We've had a few strange reports recently. People have mentioned odd tracks, weird howls at night. Could be a bear, or it could be something else. I advise you not to venture too far from more traveled roads." I tried to ask for specifics, but she gave me a sort of cautious look. Some folks call it the Mongolian monster. Arizona's version of Bigfoot, if you believe in that kind of thing. Her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she was concerned enough to warn me. She handed me a slip of paper with the ranger station number. "Cell reception is spotty here, but if you run into trouble and can get a signal, call us." I thanked her, a bit amused, but also intrigued. A local Bigfoot legend could be fun to mention in my blog, maybe drum up some interest. We parted ways, and the sun set behind the pine silhouettes. That night, I sat inside my RV editing photos from a previous trip. The forest was so quiet, it felt unnatural. Then, just past midnight, I heard something carry on the wind, a long, low moan or howl way out in the distance. My first thought was a coyote, but this sounded deeper. The second call, maybe a few minutes later, echoed through the trees, making my neck prickle. By the time I stepped outside with my flashlight, the night was silent again. I told myself it was just some large mammal, maybe a mountain lion or a big male elk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I set out on foot to scout for good photo spots. I carried my camera, a tripod, and a small pack with water and energy bars. I followed the creek upstream, hoping to find tracks or signs of black bears. Instead, I found something that didn't match anything I'd seen before. Massive footprints pressed into a muddy patch near the bank. Each print had 5 distinct toes, but they were spaced oddly, as if belonging to a broad, flat foot, easily twice the size of my own. I squatted down, snapping pictures from multiple angles, adrenaline kicking in. Bear prints can look somewhat human-like, but these lacked the usual claw imprints and had a stride that was far too long for a bear. A chill crawled up my spine. Returning to my RV, I nearly tripped over a jagged stack of branches that formed a sort of crude lean-to against a pine trunk. It looked deliberate, placed at a height I would need a ladder to reach. I saw what looked like small tufts of long, coarse hair snagged on the bark. My instincts told me this was no standard forest debris pile. I decided to set up a few camera traps, motion sensor rigs I sometimes use to capture nocturnal wildlife. With any luck, I'd get a shot of whatever made those footprints. That evening, as I was finishing the last trap near a game trail, an ATV engine whined in the distance. Soon, a man in his late 20s zipped up. He cut the engine and introduced himself as Daryl Thompson, or just Dare, grinning widely. "Photographer, huh?" he said, eyeing my camera. "You come for the Mongolian monster?" I laughed nervously. "Not really. I'm after bears. But the ranger did mention something about strange sightings." "Folks around here talk about it all the time," Dare said. "Bigfoot, skunk ape, call it what you like. But there's something in these woods. A friend of mine swears he saw it rummaging through trash near his logging site." He launched into a story about how the creature supposedly stands 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with a smell so foul it makes you gag. My mind flashed to the footprints, the weird structure of branches I saw. Could it actually be real? Dare took off after encouraging me to get that $1 million photo, leaving me half intrigued, half unsettled. I cooked a quick dinner and retreated into the RV as darkness fell again. The forest's hush returned, thick as a blanket. Around 11, I heard the now familiar moan, closer this time. A second moan followed. Then a third, which turned into a series of guttural whoops like nothing I'd heard in my life. My hands shook. I grabbed my camera but debated whether to open the door at all. The next morning, I discovered my motion sensor camera traps torn apart. One had been hurled against a tree, another ripped off its mount entirely, and the memory card was missing. Broken branches littered the area. My heart pounded as I stared at the destruction. A bear might damage gear out of curiosity, but the way these devices were shredded felt almost angry, territorial. Back at my RV, I debated leaving immediately, but the photographer in me was stubborn. I wanted to prove I could capture definitive evidence of whatever roamed these woods, maybe even land a groundbreaking shot for a wildlife magazine. I decided to move my RV a bit deeper, near a ridge Dare mentioned as a hot spot. That might have been my biggest mistake. After a long, slow drive down a rough forest road, I parked in a small clearing. The trees here were denser, the undergrowth thicker. My radio crackled with static, and I couldn't get a solid cell signal. I set out one more camera trap at dusk, taking every precaution to hide it better. Just as the last glow of sunlight slipped behind the pines, a rotting stench drifted through the clearing, faint but sickly. I scanned the area with my flashlight, seeing nothing but trunks and shrubs. The smell vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the nighttime chill. I locked up the RV and double-checked my windows. Not long after, a heavy thud rattled the metal walls. I froze, sitting at my small dining table where I'd been reviewing photos. Another thud, and the RV shook side to side. Heart hammering, I jumped up, killing the interior lights. Something outside was pushing or slamming against the vehicle. In the faint moonlight through the window, I glimpsed a massive shape move past, accompanied by that foul odor. My mouth went dry. Very carefully, I raised my camera and aimed it toward the window, snapping a few photos without flash. A guttural growl reverberated through the walls, followed by a frantic, scratching sound. I backed up toward the RV's rear door, adrenaline surging, half expecting the metal to rip open. But the presence shifted away. Through another window, I caught a glimpse of a tall, fur-covered figure loping into the trees. It disappeared, as if it had melted into the dark. My hands shook so badly, I dropped the camera onto the small bed. The next morning, my heart still pounded at the memory of that silhouette. Outside, I found claw-like scratches on the RV's side panel and a rancid odor lingering in the cold air. My head spun with questions. Was this a genuine, undiscovered primate, some supernatural entity, or had I lost my mind from lack of sleep? As I circled the campsite, a presence stepped out from behind a thick pine. The older local I'd seen earlier, living in a rundown cabin about a mile back. He eyed me warily. "You keeping up all this racket last night?" I could only stammer out something about a large animal. He spat on the ground and told me, "There's secrets here in these woods. It's time you left." Then he trudged away without further explanation. I felt a wave of indignation. This was public land. I had every right to be here, especially with a ranger's mild blessing. But fear was tugging at my resolve. I had proof, or at least some images from the night before, though I hadn't reviewed them yet. Maybe it was time to cut my losses and get out. My nerves were frayed, and the forest's hush felt less peaceful by the hour. Still, I convinced myself to check the final camera trap. So, after a quick lunch, I walked deeper into the pines, following the ridgeline. I found the camera in place, but the memory card had been yanked out and snapped in half. Something wanted to remain hidden. A surge of frustration overtook me. I let out a harsh cry into the empty forest, only the breeze answering me. It was a stupid move, but I'd reached my breaking point. Twilight was closing in fast, so I made my way back to the RV, determined to leave the next morning. The day's final rays cast long shadows, turning the forest into a maze of dark lines. Inside, I locked everything up tight, loaded my gear, and turned the key in the ignition, planning a short test run to ensure I could still drive out. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then stalled. Several tries later, it refused to start. Shaken, I rummaged in my toolkit. I'm no mechanic, but I popped the hood to see if I could spot something obvious. Loose cables, a cracked belt. Everything looked fine, but the engine wouldn't fire. Anxiety cramped my stomach. I was truly off-grid now, no immediate help. A phone that barely registered a bar of service if I angled it just right. The sun dipped below the horizon, and I scrambled to set up an emergency radio. The reception was too poor for more than static. That was when the howling began again, this time close enough to send a vibration through the thin RV walls. A series of whoops and roars followed, echoing from multiple angles, as if there were more than one creature out there, or it was incredibly good at throwing its voice. I sat in near darkness, flashlight in one hand, a useless cell phone in the other, cursing my stubbornness. The howling drew nearer, then subsided. My chest tightened, waiting for some new assault. Minutes passed. Then the pounding returned, louder, more insistent. The entire RV shook violently. My camera and gear tumbled off the table. I crouched low, my mind racing. Maybe if I slammed on the horn, it would scare the thing away. I lunged for the driver's seat, turned the key to the accessory position, and laid on the horn. A blaring wail erupted. The pounding paused. I kept pressing it, adrenaline surging. Then, from outside, a thunderous roar erupted, so furious it felt like the forest itself screamed back. I braced for impact, but the monster's footsteps thundered away, snapping branches as it retreated into the night. My heart hammered for what felt like an eternity. Silence slowly reclaimed the forest, broken only by my ragged breathing. I dared not leave the RV until dawn. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night cradling my camera, replaying every second in my head, trembling at each rustle of wind. When morning arrived, the sky was pale gray, and I ventured outside. Deep footprints circled the RV, the ground torn up where the creature had pushed or stomped. The metal siding had new dents, the paint gouged. Pine needles littered the roof. The stench lingered, like wet fur and decay. I knew I had to get out of there. Whether it was a legitimate undiscovered primate or something more supernatural, I was done tempting fate. I tried the RV engine again, nothing. My only option was to try to hike a few miles until I could call for help or flag down a passing ranger. Before leaving, I packed essentials: water, a flare gun, some snacks, and the camera with last night's pictures still on its memory card. I left most of my heavier gear behind. If I survived, I could come back. As soon as I left the clearing, I got the eerie feeling I was being followed. My footsteps crunched pine needles, each sound magnified by the hush. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning for movement. Once I caught the faintest motion behind a tree. Dark fur, maybe an arm. My pulse spiked and I gripped the flare gun. It was small comfort against something that massive. The forest thickened as I descended a steep slope, hoping the main forest road was somewhere down below. A low growl rumbled to my left, sending me stumbling right. The Mogollon monster, or one of its kin, was stalking me, letting me know it could corner me at will. In the dappled morning light, I saw it. 8 feet of bulky torso covered in coarse, dark hair, a face somewhere between ape and man, and eyes that glinted with intent. It let out a guttural bark, then bounded toward me. Panic hijacked my body. I fired the flare gun. The bright spark hissed, grazing past the creature's shoulder and disappearing into a cluster of trees. Momentarily blinded by the flash, it slowed, roaring in rage. I used that second to flee downhill, legs burning, lungs screaming for air. Branches slapped my face, undergrowth snared my ankles. The beast's howls echoed behind me, crashing through the pines like an avalanche. By sheer luck, I burst onto a dirt road. The creature paused at the tree line, letting out another rattling shriek. I glimpsed it in full daylight, tall, thick arms, steam puffing from its mouth in the cold air. For a heartbeat, we locked eyes, and I snapped a trembling photo. Then it turned away, loping back into the shadows. Maybe the open road or the noise of my flare was enough to dissuade it from crossing into full exposure. Not long after, I stumbled upon Ranger Caldwell, who was scouting with another ranger in a pickup truck. She saw me in my disheveled, terrified state and nearly jumped out of the still-moving vehicle. I babbled about the monster, the footprints, my RV. She took it seriously enough, calling in backup to help retrieve me and tow my vehicle. I rode in the truck, adrenaline still surging, showing her the scuffed images on my camera's memory card. They were blurry, but clearly showed a huge, hairy silhouette. Enough to raise questions, not enough for absolute proof. She sighed heavily, then just muttered, "I believe you encountered something, but I don't think we're ever going to settle what it is." By late afternoon, I'd been taken to a ranger station, physically intact except for bruises and scratches. The tow truck driver eventually reported he'd found my RV in rough shape, parked exactly where I said it was. No sign of any creature, just footprints, impossibly large footprints. I left Tonto National Forest the next day, battered in more ways than one. The local newspapers never wrote about a Bigfoot sighting, and the rangers kept their comments minimal. My photos were too blurry to be conclusive. A few friends suggested it was a bear standing on hind legs, or maybe a hoax by some local cryptid enthusiasts. But I know what I experienced, how the forest hushed around that massive presence, how it shook my RV, how it nearly ran me down. I still travel for wildlife photography, but I avoid that part of the Mogollon Rim. It's been months, and I sometimes wonder if the Mogollon monster truly was just protecting its territory, driving me away with force. Maybe I invaded a place humans were never meant to tread. Either way, every time I review those blurry images, I feel an uneasy mix of awe and dread. Because if there's one thing I learned in those dark pines, it's that we're not always the apex in this world, and some secrets in the wilderness are better left undiscovered. My name is Eve Marsh. I'm 29 years old, and this happened late last summer in a desolate corner of Arizona, near the Chiricahua Mountains. I'm a travel blogger, usually on the hunt for picturesque backroads and offbeat local culture. But I never expected to stumble into the kind of darkness that can hide in empty deserts. I arrived after a long day's drive, my older RV rattling over a washboard dirt road. The sun was setting, painting the desert in brilliant golds and purples, and I felt that usual rush of excitement. There's something incredible about being alone in a place so vast. I planned to spend a few days capturing the rugged beauty of the Chiricahua Range, maybe catch a monsoon storm rolling over distant peaks. My blog needed fresh content, and I figured these remote vistas would intrigue my readers. The first person I met was a park ranger named Cynthia Fields. She'd stopped her pickup a few hundred yards from where I'd parked to see if I was lost. I told her I was camping for a few nights to photograph the scenery. She gave me a concerned look and said, "You might want to stick to the main roads. We've had weird incidents lately, people roaming around who shouldn't be, things going missing. And watch out for flash floods if the monsoon hits." There was something in her tone, like she had more to say but didn't want to sound paranoid. I thanked her for the warning. She scribbled a local station number on a slip of paper and offered it to me. "Cell reception is spotty out here. If you do get a bar, call us if anything seems off." I drove deeper into the desert the next day, ignoring a few of Cynthia's cautions because, honestly, I craved a certain level of isolation for my photography. On my way, I stopped at a small ranch house hoping for directions to scenic overlooks. An older man, Tom Delgado, answered. He wore a sun-bleached hat and looked at me with wary eyes. "You're not from around here," he said. When I explained my plans, he shook his head and muttered, "You be careful. Some places out there, folks don't come back." He refused to elaborate. It wasn't exactly comforting, but I chalked it up to the usual suspicion of outsiders. I found a flat, sandy spot nestled between mesquite bushes and parked the RV. My excitement to capture vivid photos overshadowed my unease. The desert silence was intense, broken only by the rustle of wind. Temperatures soared past 100 degrees in daylight, then dropped quickly after sundown. The second night, I woke around 2 in the morning to what I thought was a distant cry, maybe an animal in distress. It was too faint to place. I slipped outside with a flashlight scanning the darkness. Nothing. The uneasy feeling clung to me, though, making it hard to sleep. The next afternoon, I decided to explore on foot. I found a dry creek bed littered with bones, likely cattle or deer, I told myself, though some of them looked suspiciously fresh. The desert heat could strip a carcass fast, so I tried not to dwell on it. As I headed back, I heard an engine and turned to see a pickup rolling up to my RV. I hurried over. Several people climbed out, men and women wearing loose, dusty clothes that seemed handmade, or at least worn beyond anything store-bought. One man, broad-shouldered with a friendly smile, introduced himself as Harlan. "We were passing by. Saw your RV," he said, offering an outstretched hand. "We live not too far from here, part of a family community. We sometimes greet travelers." My initial apprehension melted a bit at his polite manner and easy grin. Another woman, older, introduced herself as Lena and offered me a jug of cold water. "You must be baking in that RV," she said warmly. Part of me was relieved to see friendly faces after so much solitude. They asked how long I planned to stay, and I told them a few days. Harlan suggested I join them for supper at their homestead that evening. He boasted about fresh vegetables from their garden and the best smoked meat in the county. It sounded too good to refuse. He gave me directions that sounded simple enough. A turn off a rutted road, then a short drive through desert brush. I locked up my RV and followed in my vehicle, feeling a curious mixture of anticipation and cautious excitement. I wanted to see their community. Maybe it would make for an interesting blog post. Modern desert homesteaders living off the grid. Their settlement, if you could call it that, was a cluster of small buildings, some made of rough lumber, some of rusted metal. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else I couldn't name. Harlan showed me a large garden, scraggly plants, but impressive for desert conditions, and a smokehouse out back. A few of their people greeted me with polite nods, though their eyes felt oddly intense. The kids ran inside when they saw me, as if spooked by strangers. Dinner was served outdoors on a long wooden table. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky red. I was excited to taste what they'd cooked. My plate held roasted vegetables and a chunk of dark, smoky meat. "What animal is this?" I asked casually. "We raise a few goats," Lena answered quickly, too quickly perhaps. "Don't worry, it's fresh." The flavor was gamey, the texture tough. I told myself I wasn't used to goat, but my stomach nodded. Everyone around me ate in near silence except for Harlan, who occasionally flashed me that broad smile. As evening wore on, an uneasy tension settled. I noticed I was the only one who'd driven there. Everyone else lived in cabins scattered around. No one seemed in a hurry to leave. In fact, a few of them hovered near me, glancing at my camera bag. When darkness fully fell, I checked my phone for the time, realized there was no service, and politely thanked Harlan for the meal, mentioning I needed to return to my RV. He chuckled. "So soon? We haven't even shown you the orchard." But every instinct screamed that I should go. I made excuses about blogging deadlines. At that, Harlan's expression hardened. Is that more important than spending time with new friends? It wasn't a friendly question. I edged away, deciding to walk back to my RV at the far edge of their compound. A woman grabbed my arm, face tense. "Stay," she hissed under her breath. Or maybe it was help. I honestly couldn't tell. She looked frightened. I stumbled back, her nails digging into me before she let go. Then everything escalated at once. I heard a door slam behind me. Several men from the group approached, eyes cold with hostility. One brandished an old shotgun, pointing it at my legs. My stomach lurched. A wiry woman tried to yank my camera bag off my shoulder, while another rummaged my pockets for keys. I shouted in panic, but no one outside this compound would hear. Harlan stepped forward, still wearing that unnerving smile. "Now, Eve, we can't just let you wander off. You wouldn't understand our family. We've had trouble with outsiders before." I was trembling. They forced me into a musty wooden shed that smelled of damp earth and rotting meat. The door slammed behind me, locked from the outside. I pounded on it, voice breaking as I yelled for help. No response. My phone and keys were gone. My heart hammered so loud it felt like the only sound in that dark place. Time dragged. Eventually, I heard muted voices. Through a gap in the boards, I glimpsed flickering torchlight, and a few of them carrying something limp and heavy. My stomach turned. Soon, I noticed a rank odor drifting in. A reek of decay. I gagged, covering my nose. Who were these people? Cannibals? Some cult? My mind reeled with every disturbing possibility. I tried to distract myself by searching the shed for anything that could help me break out. Rusted tools, a pile of rope, a battered crate. My arm shook so badly I dropped an old crowbar. Footsteps approached, and I froze, pressing myself against the wall. The door rattled, and Harlan opened it a crack, pointing a flashlight in my eyes. "You hungry?" he asked, mockingly. "We'll feed you again soon. Gotta keep you healthy." He closed the door, laughter echoing behind him. I wanted to scream at him, but fear kept me silent. I realized they fully intended to keep me as food. The mere thought made me retch. Hours later, maybe near dawn, I heard a thunderous crack from somewhere outside. Monsoon storm or gunfire? I had no idea. I looked through the wall gap and saw lightning illuminating the desert. Another thunderclap boomed overhead. Wind whipped through the compound, toppling a few makeshift fences. My heart leapt. A storm might cause chaos, giving me a chance to escape. I rummaged in the dark again until my hand brushed metal, a small pry bar. Using it, I wedged one end under a loose floorboard near the shed's corner. It creaked. With each flash of lightning, I pried harder. Sweat poured down my face. My arms ached, but the board finally gave. I peered underneath and saw enough clearance to squeeze through if I dug out some dirt. The rain started, pounding the tin roof. The shriek of wind covered the noise I made, scraping at the dirt, pushing it aside. Each lightning flash lit my small, frantic workspace. After what felt like an eternity, there was a gap big enough for me to crawl under the wall. I wriggled through on my belly, ignoring splinters and sharp stones scraping my skin. Outside, the storm turned the hard-packed ground into slippery mud. The cult's main buildings were across an open yard to my left. Torchlight flickered inside them, but no one was out in the downpour. I spotted my RV on the far side, near a sagging fence. Adrenaline and desperation fueled me as I slipped and stumbled toward it, staying low. Rain stung my eyes. Thunder boomed overhead. I reached the RV, yanking the door handle, locked. They must have taken my keys. I remembered stashing a spare behind the passenger seat in a small magnetic box. With shaking hands, I pried open the driver's side window a crack, just enough to poke a thin scrap of wood I'd found. After several agonizing tries, I managed to nudge the little box from the seat pocket so it fell onto the floor. Then I caught its edge with the wood and slowly dragged it closer to the window until I could grab it. The entire time I expected them to appear, guns or knives in hand. Finally, I slid the window open wider and tumbled inside. My heart hammered as I fumbled for the ignition. The engine coughed before roaring to life. Relief surged so strongly I almost sobbed. I flicked on the headlights, revealing a swirl of rain and mud. I shoved the RV into gear and slammed the gas pedal. The tires spun, and for a moment I thought I'd be stuck, but the wheels caught traction, lurching me forward. I barreled through the shoddy wooden fence, hearing it crunch under the RV's front end. Lightning illuminated a group of cult members rushing outside. One fired a shotgun blast that thudded into the side of my vehicle. I ducked, feeling metal shrapnel whiz past. Another volley rang out, but I kept going, my hands white-knuckling the wheel. The rutted dirt track was quickly turning into a river of mud. If the RV bogged down, I'd be finished. Still, I pressed on, the engine whining as water splashed over the hood. Thunder roared. At one point, the road disappeared entirely, replaced by swirling floodwater. A half-submerged sign indicated the main highway was a few miles ahead. I took a chance, steering carefully, cursing each deep rut that threatened to trap me. The only reason I didn't get swept away was the RV's weight and some fluke of traction. Eventually, I spotted headlights coming from the opposite direction. A ranger's truck. I blinked through rain-streaked windows, adrenaline still spiking. The truck stopped, and I recognized Ranger Cynthia Fields from earlier. She rushed out, her face a mask of alarm when she saw the bullet holes in my RV's side. I screamed for help, barely coherent. She guided me into the passenger seat of her truck, radioing for backup. My entire body trembled. It took me a few tries to explain what had happened. Cynthia believed me, or at least believed something horrible had gone down. She drove us out of the flooding area, scanning the desert for any sign of the family, but the storm's fury erased tracks and slowed pursuit. We made it back to a ranger station after dawn. I was soaked, shivering, and in shock. Once I'd given a statement to law enforcement, the local sheriff organized a search party for the compound. According to them, the huts and the homestead's main buildings were found burned or abandoned. Monsoon rains and flash flooding made it impossible to recover much evidence. They did find a few personal items, backpacks, wallets from missing travelers. No sign of the cult members themselves, just footprints washed away in the mud. The authorities suspected we'd never see them again, or worse, they might set up elsewhere, drawing in another unsuspecting traveler. I left Arizona a day later, my RV patched up enough to limp to the next state. In the weeks following, I had nightmares about locked sheds, the stench of decay, and polite smiles masking unspeakable hunger. I thought about posting the full story on my blog, but who would believe it? Official records might label it a disturbed campsite, or a bizarre local rumor. Ranger Cynthia privately told me she believed every word. "We'll keep looking," she said, "but the desert is vast. I still travel alone, though I'm far more cautious now. Whenever I feel uneasy in a strange place, I remind myself how quickly hospitality can turn to horror. There are hungry shadows out in those lonely deserts, and they aren't always coyotes or mountain lions. Sometimes it's people, the kind who don't see others as human at all. If you ever see a ramshackle settlement offering free meals in the middle of nowhere, think twice. I learned the hard way that not all of us make it out once the sun goes down. My name is Andrew Crane. I'm 38 years old, and this happened just a few months ago in a remote part of the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge in Arizona. I had driven my battered Class B RV into the desert for one reason: to photograph the night sky without the interference of city lights. I was sick of the endless hum of civilization, the neon glow that washed out the stars. Out here, I expected nothing but stillness, celestial beauty, and perhaps a glimpse of my own insignificance. I never expected to run into something that would challenge my scientific mind and nearly cost me my life. When I first arrived, the ranger on duty, a man named Luis Contreras, waved me down near the entrance. He was in his early 30s, wore a tan uniform, and had an easygoing smile that didn't quite mask his concern. "Folks don't usually camp too deep," he said. "Rugged terrain, limited roads. We've had some odd reports. Strange lights chanting at night. Probably just folks messing around, but do me a favor and watch yourself." I nodded politely, though inwardly I chalked it up to local folklore. I'd traveled enough to know every remote region has some boogeyman story. I thanked him, accepted a slip of paper with the ranger station's number, and continued along a dusty trail deeper into Kofa. The mountains rose like jagged teeth on the horizon, and the saguaro cacti stood as silent sentinels. Eventually, I found a relatively flat patch of hard-packed dirt where I could level the RV. I killed the engine and let the peace of the desert envelop me. The first night was everything I'd hoped for. Under a moonless sky, the Milky Way sprawled across the heavens. The air was crisp, and I captured some of the most stunning shots of my life. Long exposures revealing spirals of galaxies, pinpricks of distant suns. I even started drafting a blog post in my head about the clarity of desert skies. Around 2 in the morning, when the air grew chilly, I climbed into my RV's small bed, lulled by the hush of the wilderness. The next morning, I ventured out to restock my water supply. The desert was warmer now, the sun glaring off the rocky ground. Not far from my campsite, I noticed a rusty mailbox at the end of a shabby driveway leading to a trailer. Figuring I might fill my jugs and learn a little local color, I walked up carefully and knocked on the metal door. After a moment, a woman peered out. She was in her 50s, with weathered skin and hair pulled back in a tight braid. She introduced herself as Marisol Fuentes. She eyed me with curiosity, but to my relief, agreed to let me fill my water jugs from her spigot. While the containers filled, she leaned against the trailer's flimsy wall and asked if I was out here by myself. I mentioned my astrophotography, expecting her to smile at my hobby. Instead, her expression darkened. "You haven't seen her yet?" Marisol asked softly. I frowned. "Seen who?" "La Bruja del Desierto," she said. "The Desert Witch." I'll admit, I nearly rolled my eyes, but something about Marisol's solemn tone made me hold back. She told me, in a quiet, urgent voice, how there were old stories of a woman cast out from a tribe long ago. She supposedly harnessed forbidden magic, cursed to wander these lands. Rumor had it she lured travelers off the safe paths with illusions. Some locals swore they'd seen footprints in the sand that vanished mid-stride, heard chanting at dusk, or found strange marks etched into the ground. I kept my skepticism in check, politely thanked her for the warning, and returned to my RV with full water jugs. On the drive back to my campsite, I convinced myself it was just superstition. That evening, I set up my telescope and camera again, capturing the brilliant swath of stars overhead. As midnight approached, I sat on a folding chair outside sipping coffee from a thermos. The desert was silent, the type of silence that presses on your eardrums. It reminded me of the warnings, both from Ranger Contreras and Marisol. I sniffed the air, dust and mesquite. No hint of anything supernatural. My second night, though, something changed. Around 1 a.m, I finished a photo set and stepped away from the camera to stretch. That was when I saw them. Footprints in the sand just a few yards from my RV. I'd walked around earlier, sure, but these prints didn't match my boots. They were smaller, more delicate, perhaps a woman's footprints. The odd thing was they made a short loop across the sand and stopped abruptly, as though whoever made them simply vanished. I frowned, scanning the open desert with my flashlight. Nothing but cacti and scraggly brush. A chill ran up my spine. Not long after, a distant sound reached me. Not a coyote's yip or the rustle of wind, but a low chant. So faint it might have been the breeze. I turned in every direction, trying to pinpoint it. It faded, leaving me with a racing heart. I told myself it was probably carried from miles away by the still night air. Still, I made sure my RV was locked before settling into sleep. The following day, I decided to do some exploring, partly to calm my nerves, partly to see if I could find any sign of human activity, campers, hikers, or whoever might have wandered near my site. I set out at midday, carefully marking my route with GPS coordinates so I wouldn't get lost. After trudging through the rocky washes for half an hour, I found a series of strange symbols carved or scratched into patches of hardened sand. They looked like spirals intersecting with jagged lines, nothing I recognized from typical southwestern petroglyphs. Some of them radiated outward, like sunbursts. Others were twisted shapes, reminiscent of runic characters. The hair on my arms stood on end. I followed what seemed to be a path of these symbols leading up toward the base of a tall mesa. Heat shimmered in the distance, making the rocks appear to waver. About halfway there, I spotted something that made me pause. Bleached bones scattered across a small clearing. Likely an animal kill, I told myself. Except among the bones, I saw what looked like tatters of cloth, possibly from a shirt or jacket. That stench of dread returned, and I decided to head back. If there was a real threat in these hills, human or otherwise, I didn't want to become the next set of bleached remains. That evening, I battled a growing sense of unease. My rational mind insisted there was no witch, just stories meant to frighten gullible travelers. Yet, I couldn't ignore the footprints, the chanting, and those bizarre markings. Setting up my telescope again, I tried to focus on the calm beauty of the cosmos. The desert's hush returned, so profound it felt like waiting. Just after midnight, the hush broke. A sharp thump sounded on my RV's roof. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped my flashlight. Another thump, then a scrape, as if nails or claws dragged across the metal. My heart pounded. Grabbing a wrench, my only nearby weapon, I flung open the RV door and aimed the flashlight upward. For a split second, in the beam's edge, I glimpsed what looked like a woman's silhouette perched at the top of my vehicle. Long hair, limbs gaunt and angular. Her eyes glinted in the light, reflecting like an animal's. I let out a shout, adrenaline spiking. She leapt off, disappearing behind a cluster of rocks. The rapid scuffling of footsteps faded quickly. I stood there, trembling, scanning the darkness, half expecting her to reappear. When I finally climbed onto the roof to check the damage, I found fresh scratches carved into the paint, running from front to back. That sealed it. Somebody, was messing with me. If it was a bruja, she was no harmless specter. Over the next hour, I tried in vain to call the ranger station, my phone searching for a signal that didn't exist. The hush of the desert returned, but now it felt oppressive. I barricaded myself inside the RV, heart pounding with every gust of wind against the metal frame. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my panic, and I dozed off in the driver's seat, wrench still clutched in my hand. Morning light brought a sliver of relief. I decided I'd had enough. I'd pack up, drive out, and inform Ranger Contreras. But as soon as I turned the key, the engine sputtered, refusing to start. Popping the hood, I found the ignition coil wires severed, cut clean through. My stomach sank. This was no random nuisance. Someone wanted me stranded. Remembering a passing mention of strange lights at a distant mesa, I resolved to find help on foot. Or at least escape. I stuffed my backpack with water, protein bars, a compass, and a small first aid kit. Slinging my camera around my neck, out of habit as much as anything, I set out, planning to circle back to the main road. The desert heat was punishing, but fear kept me going. After about an hour, I heard that chanting again, this time clearer, echoing off the rocks. Goosebumps prickled my skin in the midday sun. Curiosity overwhelmed caution. I followed the sound toward a narrow ravine. The chanting grew louder, twisting in the desert air. I soon spotted a figure in the distance, a woman draped in tattered, sand-colored robes. She stood near a blackened patch of earth. Animal bones and charred debris lay scattered around. My heart hammered as I crouched behind a large boulder, peering through my camera's zoom lens. The woman's face, partially hidden by stringy black hair, turned my stomach cold. Her eyes were unnaturally bright against the gloom of her face, lips parted in silent murmurs I could almost feel in my bones. Then she glanced in my direction, and a jolt of terror shot through me. I ducked down, breath ragged. She'd sensed me. That was all it took. The chanting halted, replaced by a deafening silence. I risked another look. She was gone. The clearing lay empty, the blackened patch of earth smoldering slightly as if from a recent fire. My chest tightened. I scrambled to my feet, intent on fleeing, but the desert had become a maze of illusions. The wind kicked up, swirling dust devils around me, each gust carrying faint whispers. It felt as though the land itself was shifting under my boots, every rock looking like the next. In my mounting panic, I stumbled through the rocky outcrops, trying to keep track of the sun's position so I wouldn't get turned around. The whispering wind teased me, sounding at times like my own name. A sliver of me rationalized it. Wind in the canyon can play tricks. But the rest of me was certain the witch was weaving illusions, warping my senses. More than once, I glimpsed a figure in my peripheral vision, always at the corner of my eye, disappearing when I turned my head. Then I saw water shimmering ahead, a glinting oasis. My throat felt parched, and for a fleeting moment I believed it could be real. But reason caught up. This was the desert. Mirages weren't magic, but my rational mind screamed that the Bruja might use natural phenomena to lure me in. Sure enough, when I approached, the ground was bone dry. I nearly twisted my ankle stepping into a dry wash. Another trap. Somehow, through grit and a leftover survival instinct, I made it back to the RV by late afternoon. Collapsing in the meager shade, I gulped water from my canteen. My mind raced. If the Bruja was real, if she had illusions at her command, how was I supposed to fight back? My only plan was to see if I could repair the severed wires enough to get the engine running. I rummaged for duct tape and spare cables in my toolbox, hands shaking. The harsh desert sun slid toward the horizon, giving me a narrow window before nightfall. I managed a makeshift fix, binding wires with tape and raw desperation. The engine coughed to life. Relief flooded me. I wasted no time. I threw my gear inside and tried to navigate toward the main gravel road. The sun was setting in a spectacular blaze of color, but I couldn't savor it. My entire focus was on not stalling. The illusions returned, subtle at first. An out-of-place reflection in my side mirror. A fleeting silhouette racing alongside my RV. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought I'd pass out. Night fell in earnest as I crested a small rise. That was when the illusions grew terrifyingly bold. The Bruja's face appeared in my headlights, mouth twisted in a silent shriek. I slammed on the brakes, tires skidding. The vision vanished, revealing only open desert in my beams. My breathing was ragged, knuckles aching from my grip on the wheel. I saw a signpost ahead, some battered old marker. Dim beams lit the text, Mesa Trail. Under normal circumstances, I'd avoid it, but a voice in my head insisted the main road might be the other way. Another shape flitted across the road, like a swirl of tattered cloth. The chanting returned, louder than ever, vibrating through my chest. Panicked, I turned onto the Mesa Trail, hoping to lose the illusions in a narrower path. My poor RV bounced and jerked, headlights flickering over boulders. Eventually, the trail ended at a broad plateau. In the gloom, I saw the same blackened patch of earth from earlier. My heart sank. I'd driven right into her domain. The engine sputtered, refusing to idle smoothly, and I realized I might be low on fuel after hours of driving and revving. Then the chanting crescendoed, and the witch herself stepped into the glare of my headlights. Her hair whipped in the wind, robes torn, eyes reflecting malevolent light. She raised her arms, and a swirl of dust enveloped the RV, rattling windows, flinging gravel. My mind screamed, illusions, illusions. If this was real, how could I fight it? Maybe I couldn't. I felt the entire vehicle shake as if hammered by invisible fists. The dash lights flickered. I gritted my teeth. The only idea I had was to use a flare from my emergency kit. Light, noise, maybe fire. Scrambling into the back, I found the bright orange cylinder. Another violent gust slammed the RV. My ears rang with chanting. I kicked the door open and stumbled out, raising the flare gun. Wind battered me, and the Bruja's figure loomed, flickering like a phantom in the swirling dust. I fired the flare. A burst of red light illuminated the night. For an instant, I saw her fully. A tall, emaciated form with cracked skin, dark eyes that stared hungrily. She let out a piercing wail, half-wind, half-human screech. The dust storm slackened. I seized the moment to grab a can of spare fuel from the rear compartment and hurled its contents onto the blackened earth, the place that seemed to anchor her. She lunged forward, or her shape did, illusions warping the space around us. I flicked a lighter, igniting the spilt fuel. Flames roared skyward in an instant. The Bruja's scream filled my head, drowning out thought. My vision blurred with swirling sparks. Was she real? Was I hallucinating? Both? The inferno crackled, and I saw her silhouette recede, twisting away in the flames. The chanting died off into the howling wind. I staggered back into the RV, chest heaving, tears streaming down my face from smoke and raw terror. The dust storm subsided as if a switch had flipped. My headlights cut through the thinning haze, revealing only the blazing spot on the ground. Gunning the engine, I reversed clumsily and turned around, not caring which direction led me out, so long as it was away from that cursed mesa. My GPS was worthless, but I had a rough idea from the sun's position earlier. I followed what I guessed to be an eastward track. Dawn found me exhausted, the gas gauge nearly on empty, but I eventually reached a modest service road. A few hours later, I spotted Ranger Contreras' truck parked near a dry wash. I practically collapsed when I saw him, babbling about illusions, footprints, a woman on my roof. He hurried me into the passenger seat of his truck, gave me water, and radioed for additional help. My words must have come out jumbled: magic, chanting, illusions. He looked worried I might have heat stroke or delirium from dehydration. I had no real proof, aside from the scratches on my RV and my own ravaged state of mind. In the days that followed, I recovered physically in a nearby town. Mentally, it took longer. Officially, the ranger's report mentioned a possible trespasser and the stress of desert isolation. But he listened quietly when I explained everything in calmer detail, not once dismissing me outright. I left Arizona soon after, driving to more populated areas, my nights plagued by nightmares of swirling dust and chanting. Whenever I review the photos from that trip, I find only blank frames or starry shots, nothing to indicate the brouhaha. But in one image, taken by accident near my campsite, there's a faint figure in the corner, a shape that could be a woman's silhouette. Every time I see it, my mouth goes dry. I'm still a man of science, but now I accept that not all phenomena can be neatly labeled. There might be corners of the world where ancient shadows linger, or perhaps mass hysteria can warp perception in ways we don't fully understand. All I know is, in the Kofa Desert, something hunts the unwary traveler, weaving illusions from starlight and dust. Whether she's truly a witch, a spirit, or something else, I have no intention of going back to find out. If you ever find yourself in that lonely stretch of Arizona, be mindful of footprints ending in mid-step or a voice chanting in the wind. Sometimes the desert nights hold more than the stars. My name is Ava Fletcher. I'm 34 years old, and this happened earlier this spring in a remote part of Arizona's White Mountains. I'm an ER nurse by trade, but I'd taken an overdue sabbatical to clear my head. Too many long shifts and too much heartbreak had left me exhausted. I bought a small RV, thinking the crisp mountain air and solitude would ease my mind. I chose a spot deep in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, near a partially closed campground surrounded by towering pines. I wanted quiet nights, cool mornings, and maybe some hiking under a canopy of conifers. When I first arrived, I saw why the place drew so few visitors. Rough dirt roads wound through miles of thick forest, and many sites had signs reading "Closed Wildlife Activity." I parked my RV near a small clearing with just enough flat ground to level my vehicle. The hush was immediate, broken only by birdsong and occasional breezes that whispered through pine needles. At the entrance, I'd met a friendly young ranger named Dominic Ruiz. He warned me that several campsites had been abandoned recently. People complained of odd shrieks at night and missing pets. I shrugged it off, figuring I'd handle the usual wildlife precautions, keeping trash sealed and not wandering around in the dark. My first day passed in blissful calm. I tidied up the RV, strolled around the nearby trails, and cooked a simple dinner on my propane stove. With the sun setting behind the thick pines, the air turned brisk, so I lit a small fire in the designated ring and pulled my jacket tight. The nights in the White Mountains can be surprisingly cold, but I welcomed the contrast from the scorching Arizona deserts. Everything felt perfect until around midnight. I'd crawled into my RV bed when I heard a distant, high-pitched cry, more eerie than a coyote's yip. My pulse quickened. I tried telling myself it was probably just a mountain lion or an owl, but the cry repeated, a series of shrill notes that tapered into silence. I reminded myself that many animals can make unsettling noises, especially in mountainous terrain. Still, I couldn't quite shake a tingle of unease. The next morning, I decided to go for a longer hike and maybe spot some wildlife in daylight. About half a mile from my site, I came across a small meadow near a trickling stream. Something lay beside the water, a deer, limp and obviously dead. I've seen animal carcasses before, but this made me freeze. 2 puncture marks were visible on its neck. There were no claw lacerations, no sign of a normal predator kill. The deer's belly fur and sides were oddly clean. I knelt for a closer look, noticing how little blood was around the wound. It was as though the deer's blood had been drained. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I'm an ER nurse, used to gore, but this was different. It felt wrong. I headed back to my RV, uneasy. Shortly after, I ran into an older woman named Marie Caldwell, who was hastily packing her truck camper. She seemed rattled, telling me in hushed tones that she'd heard human-like shrieks just before dawn. "They sounded so close," she said, "not like an animal at all." She slammed her tailgate shut and announced she was leaving. "I can't sleep here another night," she mumbled. "I don't know what's out there, but I don't want to find out." Then she sped off, leaving me alone in the silence. That same afternoon, Ranger Dominic stopped by while I was boiling water. He looked troubled. "We found another campsite ransacked about a quarter-mile from here," he said. "The occupant is missing. His car's still there, but he's gone. I strongly recommend you relocate closer to the main road." My nerves spiked. I asked if it might be a bear or mountain lion, but Dominic shrugged, uneasy. "Maybe. Though the footprints we saw, we can't make sense of them. Just be careful, okay?" Part of me wanted to heed his advice, but I'd come so far for peace. I told myself I just needed one more quiet night, then I'd pack up in the morning. Around dusk, as I cooked dinner outside on my propane stove, I noticed someone approaching down the gravel path. He was tall and lean, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks, odd for a campground. He carried a camera bag and offered a polite wave. "Good evening," he said. "I didn't realize anyone else was camped out here. Sorry to intrude. I'm Damien Cole, a traveling photographer." His voice had a slight accent I couldn't place, and his eyes seemed to reflect the setting sun in a way that made me stare a second too long. But I tried to be hospitable, so I offered him some coffee. He declined with a faint smile, saying he didn't drink it. Still, he settled near my fire ring, chatting easily about how he was capturing pictures of the forest at twilight. He asked me about my stay, how long I'd been here, what my routine was. Normally, I wouldn't share personal details, but his polite manner disarmed me. Yet something felt off. He stayed perched at the edge of the fire's glow, always avoiding direct light. I noticed how pale his skin was. At some point, I asked if he had a campsite. He hesitated, then said he'd parked near the closed-off area. He added that he didn't plan to stay long. As the sky darkened fully, a chill breeze picked up. Damien excused himself, stepping away as if the temperature bothered him. He offered a polite goodbye and drifted into the shadows. I peered after him, straining to see if he had a vehicle. Nothing. I shook my head, chalking it up to eccentricity. Maybe he was a nature photographer who liked his privacy. Still, his presence left me uneasy. Around 10 p.m., I locked up the RV and tried to sleep. But that nagging worry wouldn't let go. My nurse's intuition buzzed, telling me something about Damien was too neat, too carefully controlled. Then I drifted off anyway, lulled by sheer exhaustion. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a faint scuffling outside. My heart leapt. The memory of those strange puncture marks on the deer and the missing camper collided in my mind. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully cracked the RV door. The forest gloom was thick. My feeble beam caught no movement except for pines swaying in a light wind. I was about to close the door when I spotted footprints in the patch of dusty ground. Footprints that led away from the RV and vanished into darkness. No sign of a second set returning. My scalp prickled. I decided enough was enough. First thing in the morning, I'd pack up. I resolved to do it carefully, though, not wanting to drive these roads at night. I forced myself to lie back down. the flashlight still in my grip. Eventually, I drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke at dawn, the sky tinged with pale orange. Gathering my gear, I planned to be gone within an hour. While unhooking my RV's external hoses, I heard an engine approach. Ranger Dominic's truck rumbled up the dirt path. He stepped out, brow knitted. "Hey, you okay? Another site was trashed last night. People keep vanishing." I assured him I was leaving now, explaining I'd had enough of these strange occurrences. He just nodded, relieved. "I'll check in on you once you hit the main road," he said, climbing back into his truck. But fate had other plans. Around noon, dark storm clouds gathered overhead. An unexpected mountain thunderstorm. The wind picked up, and a torrent of rain began to hammer the forest, turning the dirt track into a muddy mess. I carefully navigated the RV along the rutted road, wincing each time the tires slipped. As I neared a bend, the RV lurched in a deep rut, the engine sputtering. Try as I might, I couldn't force my vehicle forward. With the ground quickly flooding, I risked getting stuck for hours. I hopped out, mud clinging to my boots, and tried to wedge a piece of wood under a tire for traction. The rain drenched me in seconds. Thunder boomed, echoing off the pines. My frustration was building to panic when, like a ghost, Damien appeared from between the dripping trees. He wore a hooded coat and carried nothing but that camera bag. I nearly screamed, not expecting to see anyone else out here. He raised his hands calmly. "I didn't mean to startle you. Need help?" he asked, voice nearly swallowed by the downpour. My instincts screamed to say no, but the RV was jammed, so I mustered a nod, heart pounding. Damien instructed me to try reversing in a slow pattern while he pushed from the front. I climbed into the driver's seat and did as he said. The wheels spun, spraying mud, but after a few tries we managed to free the RV from the rut. I exhaled relief, only to glance in the side mirror and see Damien panting, water dripping from his coat. Oddly, he didn't seem as soaked as I would have expected. He motioned for me to open the passenger door. My stomach twisted. My nurse's empathy said, "He helped you. At least let him warm up." But another part of me shouted warnings. The storm, though, was relentless, and he looked half frozen. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door. Damien slid into the passenger seat, immediately recoiling from the bright overhead light, shielding his eyes with a hiss. "Too bright," he murmured. "I'm sensitive." I flicked off the dome lamp, unsettled. A faint odor, coppery, lingered on him, or maybe that was just my nerves. Outside, lightning flashed, casting the forest in stark relief. He stared at me with those dark eyes, and something in them flickered. Hunger or need? Unnerved, I stammered a thanks for helping push the RV. He gave a half smile. "It's nothing," he said quietly, voice velvety. "You're leaving the forest, yes?" I nodded, turning the key, praying the engine still had life. It rumbled to a start. The wipers swished, barely keeping up with the downpour. I shifted into drive, letting the vehicle crawl forward. Damien settled in, gaze flicking around the interior. After a tense minute, he said, "I appreciate your kindness, letting me in. I was lost in that storm." "Where's your car?" I asked, trying not to sound accusatory. His pause felt like an eternity. "I don't have one," he finally answered, brushing wet hair from his face. "I was traveling on foot, photography, you know." It was a flimsy explanation, but I kept silent, focusing on the muddy track. Then, as I peered through the windshield, a large pine branch crashed down, blocking the road. My heart sank. I stopped the RV, the rain pounding on the roof like nails. "We'll have to clear it or find another route," I said. He nodded, expression unreadable. I reached for my flashlight and stepped outside to assess the fallen branch. Damien followed, hunched against the rain. The branch was too big to move alone. A surge of adrenaline hit me. I felt trapped. "We might have to reverse. Take a side trail," I yelled over the storm. But that route led deeper into the forest. He moved close to me, unnaturally close, his face inches from mine. Lightning illuminated his features for a split second. Parted lips revealing unnervingly white teeth, eyes gleaming. My stomach flipped. Something about him screamed danger. I backed away. "Look, maybe you should wait in the RV," I said, voice shaking. He laughed softly, a mirthless sound. "We can make do, don't be afraid." Then, as thunder rattled the sky, he lunged forward with terrifying speed. I barely had time to register what was happening before he pinned me against the RV's side, a hand clamped over my mouth. His grip was ice cold, unbelievably strong. The stench of that coppery odor hit my nostrils again, and in the flicker of lightning I saw elongated canines in his grin. My mind rebelled. No, this can't be real. Vampires aren't real. But there he was. Panic lit my veins. I twisted and bit down on his hand, an instinctive, desperate act. He hissed, momentarily loosening his grip. Summoning all my strength, I broke free and scrambled around the rear of the RV. He moved in a blur, blocking me again. Rain slicked my vision, and thunder boomed. For an instant, I stared directly into his eyes. A wave of dizziness threatened to pull me under, as if he was mesmerizing me. My nurse's training, fighting sedation, staying alert, made me snap out of it. I jabbed the flashlight toward his face, shining it bright, and saw him recoil. That was enough for me to duck around him and fling open the RV door. Scrambling inside, I slammed it shut and threw the lock. He pounded on it with unnatural force. The metal door rattled. I heard him rasp my name, voice thick with menace. "Ava, let me in." I wedged a chair under the handle, though I doubted it would hold if he truly wanted in. The entire RV rocked as he tried to shove it over. My heart hammered, and my mind raced. How do you defend against something you don't believe in? I remembered bits of lore, stakes, sunlight, religious items. None of it felt real, yet I needed a weapon. Opening a drawer, I grabbed a serrated carving knife, hands trembling. Another drawer yielded a short wooden dowel that could be sharpened. Outside, Damien battered the RV, hissing and snarling. My breath came in ragged gasps. He might flip the entire RV if he tried. Suddenly, everything went quiet, except for the rain. I waited, knife in hand, pulse thunderous in my ears. Did he leave? Or was he tricking me? After a minute of agonizing silence, I looked out a window, no sign of him. My interior lights flickered with a loose wire hum. Then a new sound. Scraping on the roof. I realized in horror he might tear open a vent or skylight. Lightning flared, revealing a small overhead vent handle twisting from outside. I lunged, bracing the vent. I could see pale fingers prying the plastic edge. "Stop!" I yelled, ramming the handle closed. A feral growl rattled from above, followed by a ripping sound as the plastic began to crack. The entire roof groaned. Desperate, I jammed the wooden dowel under the vent in a makeshift brace, then grabbed my flashlight and opened my side door. I'd have to confront him outside. Staying in here was a death trap if he got in. Rain stung my face as I slipped into the storm. The flashlight beam swept across the ground, revealing no immediate figure. Water dripped from the pines. Thunder grumbled in the distance. Slowly, I circled the RV. He stood at the rear, black hair plastered to his forehead, eyes glinting red in the lightning flashes. I raised the knife and he laughed, a guttural sound devoid of warmth. His gaze flicked up. Thin clouds were parting overhead, letting in just the slightest glow of dawn's approach or maybe the moon. He looked uneasy, shifting in the mud. I remembered how he reacted to bright light. Summoning my courage, I found a small emergency flare in my belt pouch. I'd used one once while backpacking. I popped its cap. An intense red glare blossomed, casting flickering shadows. He snarled, recoiling from the brilliance. I advanced, waving the flare. My hand trembled so violently I nearly dropped it. He hissed, raising an arm to shield his face, stepping backward. This was my chance. With a roar of desperation, I thrust the carving knife forward. He dodged, fast as a viper, but lost his footing in the mud. He slipped, and I managed a glancing slash across his shoulder. Dark fluid, blood or something like it, ran in rivulets, diluted by the rain. He howled, teeth bared. Lightning illuminated him as he lunged, but a sudden break in the clouds let the moon shine through, and he hissed again, staggering. I kicked at his legs. He collapsed onto the soaked ground, glaring up at me with a mix of rage and pain. "You won't escape me," he rasped, voice low and cold. I held the flare closer, forcing him to edge away from the light. Then I saw the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. If I could keep him at bay a little longer, maybe the sun would drive him off, or kill him outright, if legends held any truth. Drenched to the bone, adrenaline spiking, I swung the flare again, hurting him away from the RV. He clawed at the ground, trying to stand. Fear clenched my gut. What if partial sunlight wasn't enough? My arms ached, but I kept brandishing the searing light. At last, the sky brightened further, color spreading across the east. Damien hissed in agony as the dim morning sun broke through. A faint smoke curled at the edges of his coat. In a final furious glare, he sprinted into the woods, melting into the pines. I collapsed to my knees, sobbing in relief, the flare sputtering in my hand. Dawn had arrived, the storm now a drizzle. My entire body shook. There was no time to lose. I scrambled back to the RV, started it up, thankfully it turned over, and skirted around the fallen branch with careful maneuvering. My eyes stayed glued on the tree line, half expecting him to reappear. He didn't. As I navigated the mud-soaked road, the sun rose higher, painting the forest in a gentle light that felt like a blessing. Miles later, I emerged onto the main highway, battered, drenched, and in shock. I spotted Ranger Dominic's truck parked near a diner in a small mountain town. I pulled up beside him, stumbling out of the RV. He took one look at my state, blood-smeared coat, trembling hands, and rushed to support me. I explained the attack, voice shaking, carefully omitting the more unbelievable details about fangs and superhuman speed. Even so, he was alarmed enough to radio for backup. Authorities later combed the area where I'd been camped. They found a ravaged deer carcass, scattered footprints, and signs of a struggle, but no trace of Damien Cole. One trooper joked that maybe I'd encountered a mountain man, but from the look in Dominic's eyes, he knew it was something far darker. I left the White Mountains that same day, vowing never to venture so far off-grid alone again. My mind replayed Damien's last glare, the searing memory of those inhuman eyes. I still can't rationalize what I saw. I'm a nurse, a woman of science, but I know what nearly killed me out there in the pines wasn't human, and whenever the wind howls at night, I dream of a pale figure weaving between the trunks, waiting for the next camper who dares to spend a lonely night in those haunted woods. I can still feel that subtle ache in my shoulder where he pinned me, as if a bruise lingers beneath the skin. In quiet moments, I wonder if he truly fled or if he's merely biding his time. But one thing is certain. I survived an encounter with something impossible, and if there's one lesson I carry, it's this. Sometimes the wildest legends have teeth, and they bite hard when you least expect it. 01.